I am Harrison Caldwell. I am 70 years old. I built a massive corporate empire from absolutely nothing, and I thought I had a family that respected my legacy. My son gifted me a luxury trip to Cambodia. "You deserve to relax, Dad," he told me, handing me a first-class ticket. But less than 5 minutes after he drove away from the airport drop-off, a stranger grabbed my arm, his face pale and shaking. "Do not get on that plane," he whispered. "I just heard your son on the phone, and if you get on that flight, your life is over." I froze, and what he said next shattered my entire reality. If you are watching this, take a deep breath. The betrayal I uncovered that day will make you question everyone you trust. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, and tell me where you are watching from in the comments. The loud screech of my heavy luggage wheels echoed against the high glass ceilings of Denver International Airport. It was a crisp, bright Tuesday morning. It was exactly the kind of day that makes you feel alive and full of purpose. At 70 years old, I was finally doing what everyone, especially my doctors, had been telling me to do for a decade. I was stepping back. For 40 long years, I had poured every ounce of my blood, sweat, and soul into building Caldwell commercial real estate, from a single rented desk into a massive corporate empire across the American West. I missed holidays. I missed birthdays. I sacrificed my own youth so my family would never know the bitter taste of poverty. And now I was finally handing the reins to my 38-year-old son, Preston. We stood outside the VIP departure terminal. Preston looked incredibly sharp in his tailored navy suit. It was the exact same custom fit I used to wear when I was his age. He was the golden child groomed from birth to sit at the head of the boardroom table. He checked his solid gold watch. That was the watch I bought him when he closed his first $1 million deal. Then he smiled broadly and handed me a thick, glossy travel itinerary bound in a beautiful leather folder. "3 weeks completely off the grid," Dad Preston said. His voice was full of warmth and confidence. "No cell service, no board meetings, no emergency emails. Just you, the jungle, and some absolute peace and quiet at the best eco-resort in Cambodia. You deserve this more than anyone. You built this empire, now let me run it for a while." I patted his shoulder. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of accomplishment. I had raised a capable, confident man, a son who cared deeply about my physical and mental well-being. I told him I trusted him completely. We shared a tight, meaningful embrace right there on the curb. I watched his black luxury SUV merge back into the heavy airport traffic. I felt completely at ease, ready for the next chapter of my life. I turned around, gripped the leather handle of my suitcase, and walked toward the sliding glass doors to check in for my international flight. That was the exact moment my perfect, comfortable reality shattered into a million sharp pieces. "Excuse me, sir?" "Wait." A hand clamped down hard on my forearm. The grip was unusually tight, almost desperate. I spun around, startled, ready to shout at whoever was grabbing me. It was an older man wearing the blue uniform of a TSA agent. His plastic name tag read Vince. He looked to be around my age, maybe in his late 50s or early 60s. But it was his face that stopped me from speaking. He was completely pale, looking like he had just seen a ghost. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his eyes darted around nervously, as if we were being watched by a hidden sniper. Before I could ask what was going on, he pulled me hard behind a thick concrete pillar. We were suddenly completely out of sight from the main drop-off lane and the terminal windows. "What are you doing?" I demanded. I tried to forcefully pull my arm away. "I need to catch a flight." "Do not get on that plane," he whispered. His voice was trembling so badly he could barely get the words out. "Please, sir, just listen to me for 1 second." I looked at him. I was completely confused and mildly annoyed. I asked him if he knew who I was. I asked if this was some kind of elaborate prank or extortion attempt. "I do not know your name," he said, swallowing hard. "But I know the man who just dropped you off." I was taking my smoke break behind the concrete barriers near the VIP lane. "I saw your son drop you off. I saw you hug him. But as soon as you turned your back and started walking away, his whole demeanor changed. It was like a switch flipped." I frowned. A cold, uncomfortable prickle started at the base of my neck. What do you mean? Vince wiped his sweaty forehead with the back of his hand. He got back into his car, but he did not drive away immediately. He rolled his window down and pulled out a cheap plastic phone, a burner phone. He dialed a number and started talking. He was angry, sir. He was giving aggressive orders. I told the agent he must have misunderstood the situation. Preston was the chief executive officer of a major real estate firm. He was probably just handling a sudden crisis with a contractor or a difficult corporate client. No, Vince insisted. He grabbed my arm again, his grip even tighter this time. Listen to me carefully. He looked right at you walking away, and he said the old man is boarding. He is out of the picture for 3 weeks. Transfer all the debt to his personal accounts and trigger the bankruptcy filings immediately. Make sure he takes the fall for everything. The words hung in the chilly morning air like a brutal death sentence. Transfer the debt. Trigger the bankruptcy. Make sure he takes the fall. My world completely stopped spinning. The ambient noise of the bustling airport, the automated announcements echoing over the loudspeakers, the low roar of commercial jet engines taking off in the distance, it all faded into a dull, heavy hum. The world tunneled down to the frightened face of the man standing in front of me. I stared at Vince. I searched his eyes for any sign of deceit. I looked for any sign that he was crazy, hallucinating, or trying to trick me. But there was nothing there but genuine, raw fear. Why would a random TSA agent risk his secure job to pull a wealthy passenger aside and tell such a specific, horrific lie? He would not. My breathing grew terribly shallow. My chest tightened so painfully, I thought I was having a heart attack. Preston, my own son, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle in the driveway of our very first home, the man I had entrusted with my entire life's work. Was he bankrupting me? Was he planning to leave me with absolutely nothing while I was trapped in another country? I asked Vince to repeat exactly what he heard, every single word without leaving anything out. Vince nodded. He spoke quickly, looking over his shoulder. He said transfer the debt to his personal accounts. Trigger the bankruptcy filings immediately. And then he said make sure he takes the fall. Sir, I do not know what kind of business you are in, but that man is setting you up to take a massive, devastating hit. If you get on a plane for 20 hours, if you go off the grid for 3 weeks, like he said on the phone, you are going to come back to absolute zero. Or much worse, you will be arrested by federal agents the moment you land back on American soil. My mind raced 1,000,000 miles a minute. 40 years of ruthless corporate negotiations kicked in. I was fighting desperately against the crushing emotional agony of a father hearing that his son was plotting his absolute ruin. I took a deep, shaky breath and forced myself to think clearly, to push the heartbreak down into my stomach and focus on survival. Thank you, I told Vince. I pulled a crisp $100 bill from my money clip and pressed it into his trembling hand. You never saw me today. You never heard anything. Go back to work right now and forget my face entirely. Vince nodded quickly, visibly relieved to be done with the situation. He took the money, turned around, and slipped quietly away into the crowded airport terminal, leaving me entirely alone. I stood frozen behind the pillar. The heavy travel itinerary felt like a concrete block in my hand. Cambodia. Dense jungles. Ancient temples. No cell service. No internet access. It was not a generous, loving vacation from a grateful son. It was an isolation chamber. A perfectly timed, beautifully disguised trap designed to keep me completely blind and deaf while he dismantled my financial existence and framed me for his crimes. I leaned back against the cold concrete. My chest heaved up and down. I felt a sudden sharp pain in my heart. It was the kind of pain that comes from a betrayal so deep it physically breaks something inside of you forever. But then the blinding grief began to burn away. It was swiftly replaced by a familiar, icy calculation. I had stared down ruthless corporate raiders. I had survived market crashes that wiped out men half my age. I did not survive 40 years in the brutal cutthroat world of commercial real estate by being a naive victim. If my own flesh and blood thought I was just some clueless old man, he could toss into the garbage he was about to learn a very painful, very permanent lesson. I needed absolute proof before I tore my family apart. I needed to know if the man I raised was truly capable of leaving me with nothing. I pulled out my cell phone. My hands were shaking with a toxic mixture of dread and pure, unadulterated rage. I prepared to make the call that would test the waters of this incredible deception. I pushed myself off the cold concrete pillar, forcing my legs to move. I did not want to stand out. I did not want to look like a man whose entire universe had just collapsed. I gripped the handle of my leather suitcase and steered myself away from the ticketing counters, blending into the morning rush of travelers. My vision tunneled. The bright fluorescent lights of the Denver terminal seemed to hum with an unbearable intensity. I needed privacy. I needed a space to think where no one could see the tremor in my hands. I veered toward the nearest men's restroom, bypassed the sinks, and locked myself inside the furthest stall. The space was cramped and smelled faintly of industrial bleach. I lowered the toilet seat cover and sat down heavily. The cold porcelain seeped through my trousers, but I barely registered it. My chest was tight, each breath a conscious, painful effort. I stared at my phone screen. The wallpaper was a photo of Preston and me from a fishing trip in Montana 5 years ago, right after my wife Beatrice had passed away. He had his arm around my shoulders. We were smiling. It looked like the picture of perfect familial loyalty. Now that smile felt like a thick, suffocating mask. I had to know. I had to hear his voice. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my vocal cords. I could not let him sense my panic. If Vince was right, if my son was truly orchestrating my financial execution, showing my hand too early would be a fatal mistake. I tapped Preston's name on the screen and lifted the phone to my ear. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. With each ring, the heavy thud of my heartbeat echoed loudly in my ears. I prayed he would not answer. I secretly hoped it would go straight to voicemail so I could delay the inevitable confrontation. But on the 4th ring, the line clicked open. "Hey, Dad, did you forget something already?" Preston's voice washed over the line. It was smooth, cheerful, and completely untroubled. There was no tremor of guilt. There was no hurried anxiety of a man executing a massive corporate coup. He sounded exactly like the loving son who had just hugged me goodbye 10 minutes ago. He sounded entirely perfect. No, I forced a light chuckle, aggressively rubbing the bridge of my nose. "I have my passport. I have the itinerary. I am just standing in line for security right now." "Good," Preston laughed. It was a warm, rich sound. "You had me worried for a second there. You know you tend to lose your reading glasses when you travel." I was about to turn the car around and search the drop-off lane. The casual affection in his tone was highly disorienting. Could a man who was actively framing his father sound so genuinely caring? The cognitive dissonance made my head spin. I pictured him sitting in his luxury SUV, navigating the airport exit traffic, holding his expensive steering wheel with one hand, while effortlessly lying to my face. I had to push past the heavy emotional fog. I needed to cast the bait. "Actually, Preston." I started keeping my pitch perfectly casual, as if I were mentioning a minor inconvenience like a delayed flight. "I am calling because something strange just happened." I turned my phone back on to check an email, and I had a very weird voicemail from one of the senior executives at First National. There was a pause on the line. It was a microscopic fraction of a second, but after 40 years of negotiating high-stakes real estate deals, I had trained my ears to catch the smallest hesitations. A normal person would never notice it, but I noticed it instantly. First National, Preston repeated. The warmth was still there, but the casual looseness had slightly tightened. What did they say? It was a fragmented message. I continued, smoothing my voice into a tone of mild, grandfatherly confusion. The connection was terrible, but the banker sounded quite urgent. He mumbled something about a massive debt transfer and repeatedly mentioned the word bankruptcy. It honestly sounded like he was trying to verify a sudden corporate filing. I figured I should call you before I board this 20-hour flight just to make sure there is no strange glitch in our payroll accounts, or some kind of wire fraud happening while my back is turned. I held my breath. I waited in the stale air of the bathroom stall, listening to the faint background noise of his car engine through the speaker. If he panicked, if he stumbled over his words, or made a clumsy excuse to hang up the phone, I would know without a doubt that Vince was telling the truth. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing my body for the worst possible confirmation. Instead, Preston let out a long, exaggerated sigh, followed by a deeply fond, reassuring laugh. "Oh, Dad," he chuckled warmly. "You really cannot turn off that aggressive business brain, can you? Even when you are literally standing in line to go on a tropical vacation." "Well, you know me," I managed to reply smoothly. "A sudden mention of bankruptcy tends to spike my blood pressure." "Calm down, please," Preston said. His delivery was absolutely flawless. It was a masterclass in corporate reassurance. There is zero fraud. Nobody is going bankrupt. I know exactly what First National was calling you about. Remember the Silverstone Plaza project? The old warehouse district development we paused last year? I blinked. Silverstone Plaza. It was a massive commercial zoning project that had stalled due to complex permit issues. It was a heavy financial liability on our books, a dead weight we had been carrying for quite a while. "Yes," I said cautiously. "I remember Silverstone perfectly well. But what exactly does that have to do with a sudden bankruptcy filing?" "I am moving the Silverstone debt into a newly formed subsidiary to liquidate that dead project," Preston explained smoothly. "It is a standard strategic move. By shifting that specific bad debt into a separate holding company and filing for a localized restructuring, we get a massive tax write-off for the quarter without affecting the main corporate umbrella." Our legal team finalized the entire strategy yesterday afternoon. First National was probably just calling to confirm the automated transfer protocols before they processed the final subsidiary paperwork. His explanation was incredibly coherent. It was legally sound. It was exactly the kind of aggressive, highly intelligent financial maneuvering I had personally taught him to execute. It made perfect, undeniable sense. "I see," I murmured, staring blankly at the gray grout between the dirty bathroom tiles. "I was going to tell you everything when you returned," Preston said. "You are supposed to be relaxing, Dad. Let me handle the heavy lifting." The lie was flawless, delivered with the warmth of a loving son. The line went dead. I sat alone in the silent bathroom stall, the phone still pressed firmly against my ear. I almost believed his perfect explanation, but then I somehow just knew. I lowered the phone from my ear and stared at the dark screen. My heart was hammering violently against my ribs, echoing the sheer magnitude of the emotional devastation I was processing in real time inside this cold restroom. The bathroom stall was completely silent, save for the rhythmic dripping of a faulty faucet somewhere down the row. My reflection in the stainless steel dispenser looked pale and drawn. Preston had sounded so incredibly convincing. He had used the exact corporate jargon I had drilled into him for years. He had maintained a perfect, steady cadence. If I had been anyone else, I would have walked out of this restroom, boarded that flight, and comfortably sipped champagne for the next 20 hours. But I was not anyone else. I was the man who built the company he was currently running. And my son had made one fatal, careless mistake. Silverstone Plaza was not a dead-weight project waiting for a strategic tax write-off. Silverstone Plaza had been fully and finally liquidated 4 months ago. I knew this for an absolute fact because I had personally signed the closing documents before handing the daily operations over to him. I had negotiated the final sale of that specific acreage to a logistics firm in late February. The funds from that sale had already cleared and been thoroughly documented in our quarterly earnings report. There was absolutely no debt left to transfer. There was no subsidiary required. My son had just lied to my face with the practiced ease of a seasoned predator. He had taken a piece of real estate history and twisted it into a convenient shield, assuming my memory was fading with my age. assuming I was truly the clueless old man that TSA agent had overheard him mocking. The cold, heavy knot in my stomach tightened until it felt like a solid block of ice. The betrayal was no longer a terrifying possibility whispered by a stranger. It was a tangible, undeniable reality. I needed to know how far the damage had already spread. If Preston was lying about shifting debt, what else was he manipulating behind the closed doors of our executive suites? My hands were shaking so severely, I nearly dropped the phone into the sink. I unlocked the screen and opened my personal banking application. I completely bypassed the corporate accounts and navigated straight to my private retirement trust. This was a heavily guarded standalone account that held the bulk of my personal liquid assets completely separate from the Caldwell commercial real estate umbrella. It was my ultimate safety net, built over 4 decades of tireless work and sacrifice. I typed in my secure password. I waited for the loading screen to clear my breath, catching in my throat. The familiar blue interface did not appear. Instead, the screen went completely white. A stark red notification box popped up in the center of the display. Access denied. Legal hold. Please contact your branch administrator immediately. I stared at those words until they blurred together. Access denied. Legal hold. The air in the small stall suddenly felt impossibly thin. I could not pull enough oxygen into my lungs. A legal hold on a private trust of that magnitude was not a simple clerical error. It was a catastrophic, highly coordinated financial maneuver. It required court orders, sworn affidavits, and a mountain of fabricated evidence presented to a federal judge. Preston had not just made a few unauthorized transfers. He had fundamentally dismantled my entire financial existence while I was busy packing my suitcase for a vacation he had orchestrated. He had used my complete trust against me. He had used my desire to step back and enjoy my twilight years as the perfect weapon. Every warm smile, every reassuring pat on the back, every time he told me I deserved to relax, it was all a calculated performance. He had been slowly poisoning the well, setting up the exact parameters needed to freeze my assets the moment I stepped out of the picture. The TSA agent was entirely correct. If I boarded that flight to Cambodia, I would be stranded in a foreign jungle without a single cent to my name, completely incapable of fighting back, while my son systematically stripped my empire down to the studs. Panic is a useless emotion in a crisis. I had learned that lesson decades ago during the market crash that almost wiped out my early business. You do not survive by freezing. You survive by moving forward. The sheer magnitude of Preston's operation meant he had to be tracking my movements. If he had the capability to legally freeze a heavily protected trust fund, he certainly had the resources to monitor my mobile device. Every text, every call, every location ping was a liability. I pulled the protective case off my phone with a sharp, forceful motion. I retrieved a small metal pen from my inner jacket pocket and used the tip to aggressively pop open the side tray. The tiny plastic SIM card fell into the palm of my hand. This was the only tether connecting me to my old life. It was the only way my son could confirm my location. I placed the small chip between my thumb and forefinger and pressed down hard until I felt the satisfying snap of the plastic breaking in half. I dropped the broken pieces straight into the toilet and flushed them away. I was completely disconnected. For the first time in 40 years, the founder of Caldwell Commercial Real Estate was entirely off the grid. I opened the stall door and walked out into the bright, humming corridor of the airport. My luxury leather suitcase was still sitting precisely where I had left it near the entrance of the restroom. It contained 3 weeks' worth of expensive tropical clothing, a high-end digital camera, and the naive illusions of a proud father heading into retirement. I did not even look at it. I walked straight past the luggage, leaving it abandoned on the polished tile floor. Luggage meant a predictable pattern of travel. I could not afford that. I merged into the dense crowd of morning travelers, keeping my head down, and my pace brisk but perfectly normal. I did not look back at the VIP terminal where my son had hugged me just 30 minutes prior. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors and stepped out into the crisp, biting air of the Colorado morning. The drop-off lanes were packed with idling taxis. I bypassed the transportation hub entirely. I walked down the concrete sidewalk, putting physical distance between myself and the terminal. I felt a strange sense of liberation mixed with profound grief. The man who woke up looking forward to a peaceful retirement was dead. My son made sure of that. But the ruthless builder who forged an empire from nothing was alive. I flagged down a passing cab, climbed into the back seat, and told the driver to take me directly toward the dusty, forgotten industrial outskirts of Denver. I was now officially a ghost, and now it was time to prepare for war. The taxi ride felt like a slow descent into a completely different dimension. For decades, my entire view of Denver consisted of sweeping skyline vistas from the tinted windows of a chauffeur-driven town car or the panoramic glass walls of my penthouse executive suite. Now, I was watching the glittering high-rises fade away, replaced by the crumbling brick facades, graffiti-covered alleyways, and rusted chain-link fences of the neglected industrial district. I asked the driver to pull over at a dilapidated gas station that looked like it had not been renovated since the late 1980s. I handed him a 50 and told him to keep the change. Inside the brightly lit convenience store, I bypassed the aisles of cheap snacks and walked straight to the register. I bought a prepaid cellular phone and the maximum amount of cash load cards legally allowed in a single transaction. The board clerk barely looked up from his magazine as I handed over a stack of $20 bills. I walked out into the dusty parking lot, tearing the cheap plastic packaging open with my bare hands. 3 blocks down the road, I found exactly what I needed. It was a single-story motel with a flickering neon sign advertising hourly rates and free basic cable. The asphalt parking lot was heavily cracked, sprouting weeds through the broken pavement. I walked into the cramped lobby and paid for a room using the last of the cash I carried. The tired night clerk slid a heavy brass key across the scratched linoleum counter without asking for a single piece of identification. Room number 7 was located at the very back of the property, directly facing a tall concrete retaining wall. I pushed the door open and was greeted by the overwhelming scent of stale cigarette smoke and cheap pine cleaner. The carpet was a faded brown, heavily worn down in the center. A single sagging mattress sat against the wall, covered by a thin polyester bedspread. I walked over to the small, scratched wooden desk and sat down on the squeaky metal folding chair. A billionaire, the proud founder of the largest commercial real estate empire in the Western region, reduced to a $40 a night motel room. I did not have my designer suits. I did not have my security detail. I did not even have a piece of luggage. I placed the cheap plastic phone on the desk and stared at it blankly. The absolute silence of the room was completely deafening. I needed to formulate a concrete strategy, but to do that, I had to honestly assess my vulnerabilities. My personal retirement trust was locked down under a fabricated legal hold. That meant Preston had likely compromised my highest domestic banking contacts. If he had manipulated a federal judge into granting that hold, he certainly possessed a massive mountain of expertly forged documentation. I could not simply walk into the corporate headquarters tomorrow morning and demand answers from my executive team. I had absolutely no idea how deep the rot actually went. Who could I possibly trust? The board of directors. No, Preston had spent the last 2 years actively courting them, taking them to expensive steakhouse dinners and luxury golf retreats, charming them all with his flawless corporate facade. The legal department. No, the general counsel was a young, ambitious lawyer that Preston had personally recruited and hired just 8 months ago. Anyone currently drawing a salary from Caldwell Commercial Real Estate was a potential liability. I was entirely isolated. I rubbed my temples, feeling a sharp headache forming behind my eyes. I needed someone who completely understood the deep, complex financial plumbing of my entire company. I needed a person who knew exactly how the digital money flowed through the various subsidiaries and obscure holding accounts. More importantly, I needed someone who possessed absolute unquestionable loyalty to me and absolutely zero loyalty to my treacherous son. The sudden realization hit me with the crushing force of a physical blow. The perfect answer had been staring me directly in the face for an entire year. Diane. Diane was my fierce, brilliantly analytical chief financial officer for more than 2 decades. We had bravely navigated the treacherous waters of the 2008 market crash together. She knew where every penny in my vast empire was buried. And exactly 1 year ago, shortly after Preston was promoted to chief operating officer, she abruptly announced her early retirement. At the time, Preston had told me she was experiencing severe corporate burnout and wanted to spend more time with her grandchildren in the quiet suburbs. He had offered her a lucrative severance package, and she quietly packed up her desk and left the building. I had trusted his smooth assessment completely. Now sitting alone in the gloomy light of the cheap motel room, the horrific truth finally clicked into place. Diane did not retire because of burnout. She was forcibly pushed out. Preston had systematically removed the only person in the entire corporate hierarchy who possessed the intelligence and the direct access to catch his massive financial fraud. She was my only remaining hope. I picked up the plastic burner phone and keyed in the activation codes. I relied entirely on my memory, praying her personal cellular number had not changed in the past 12 months. My thumbs were clumsy on the tiny keypad. I pressed the green call button and lifted the device to my ear, listening to the digital ringtone. My stomach twisted into tight knots. What if she refused to answer an unknown number? What if she had moved out of state? What if Preston had successfully bought her permanent silence with that massive severance package? The phone rang 4 agonizing times. I was just about to hang up when the line abruptly clicked open. Hello. Her voice was cautious, carrying a slight edge of suspicion toward the unregistered caller identification. Diane, I said, keeping my voice as steady as humanly possible. It is Harrison Caldwell. I need you to listen to me very carefully right now, and I need you to promise me you will not hang up this phone. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. It was the kind of silence that usually precedes a dial tone. But then I heard a sharp, genuine intake of breath. Harrison. She sounded completely shocked. Are you calling me from a blocked number? Why do you sound like you are hiding in a closet? Are you not supposed to be flying over the Pacific Ocean right now? I closed my eyes, feeling a massive wave of relief wash over my exhausted body. She had not forgotten me. Diane. I did not get on that airplane, I told her firmly. The trip was a trap. Preston has locked down my personal retirement trust, and I have reason to believe he is tearing the company apart from the inside. I am sitting in a cash-only motel room. I cannot access my bank accounts, and I do not know who else is working for him. I need your help immediately. There was a heavy silence on the line. When Diane spoke, her voice was crisp. Give me an address, Harrison, she said. I will be there in 30 minutes. I gave her the location of a dilapidated diner 2 miles from my motel. It was a miserable establishment, illuminated by a flickering neon sign. It was the last place anyone from corporate headquarters would expect to find the founder of Caldwell Commercial Real Estate. I walked there in the biting cold and took a booth in the darkest corner. Exactly 28 minutes later, Diane walked in. She was not wearing her usual tailored business suits. She wore a simple dark trench coat, blending perfectly into the bleak surroundings. She slid into the torn vinyl booth across from me and placed a heavy canvas messenger bag on the table. We looked at each other in total silence. She took in my pale face and the sheer desperation I was trying to mask. I always knew this terrible day would come, she whispered softly. I just prayed I was wrong about him. I took a slow sip of my bitter coffee. You knew Preston was planning something malicious, I asked, feeling a sharp pang of betrayal. Diane shook her head quickly, her eyes full of intense regret. Not the specific details, Harrison. I did not know he would try to bankrupt you or freeze your personal assets, but I knew the company was being systematically hollowed out. A year ago, right after you officially promoted him, Preston brought in an outside technology firm. He claimed it was a routine security upgrade, but the people leading the project were brought in entirely by Monica. Monica, I repeated, feeling a violent surge of disgust. My daughter-in-law was a prominent socialite. She had absolutely no business interfering with the digital architecture of my real estate empire. Yes, Monica Diane confirmed, leaning closer. She played the innocent wife, but she directed the entire tech team. Within 3 weeks, they had completely walled off the executive financial ledgers. They created a restricted digital environment that even I could not penetrate without Preston generating a daily authorization code. When I started demanding answers, Preston called me into his office. He handed me a massive severance package and a strict non-disclosure agreement. He threatened to drain my pension in endless litigation if I spoke to you. He said you were stepping down anyway, and it was his ship to steer now. I closed my eyes tightly. I had been so willfully blind. I had allowed my own son to weaponize my company against my most loyal employees. But you did not just walk away, I said, meeting her sharp gaze. You are far too smart to just take a check and disappear. Diane permitted herself a grim smile. She reached into her bag and pulled out an outdated laptop. No, I did not. I knew they were locking the main gates, so I left a window open before they revoked my credentials. I buried a ghost account deep inside the legacy code of the Human Resources portal. It is a digital backdoor that bypasses the central financial dashboard entirely. It gives us raw data streams enough to see the money moving. She powered on the thick plastic laptop. It hummed loudly. She pulled a mobile hotspot from her pocket and connected the machine. The tension in the booth was thick. I watched her type in complex code. After 3 agonizing minutes, the interface suddenly flashed green. We are firmly in, she whispered, turning the screen toward me. The display was filled with endless columns of financial spreadsheets. This was the raw, bleeding heartbeat of the company. Diane began filtering the massive amounts of data with practiced precision. Look right here, she pointed to a massive cluster of outgoing wire transfers. Preston restricted access to the vendor names, but look at the sheer volume. This is a catastrophic hemorrhage of liquid cash. Millions of dollars are being falsely categorized as consulting fees and material acquisitions for projects that have been closed for months. I stared at the numbers. $700,000. $1.2 million, $3 million. It was a relentless waterfall of wealth pouring out of the accounts I had spent my life building. Where is it going? I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Can you trace the destination routing numbers? Diane shook her head in frustration. No. The digital trail hits a heavily encrypted firewall right after the funds clear the primary holding accounts. Whatever shadow firm Monica hired, they knew exactly how to scrub a digital footprint permanently. To federal regulators, this just looks like standard corporate bloat. We cannot prove fraud with just this raw data alone. I leaned back against the vinyl seat. The situation felt completely hopeless. If we could not trace the money, we could not legally prove Preston was intentionally sabotaging the empire. He would simply claim poor management right off the losses and walk away clean while I took the fall for the bankruptcy. But we do not need to trace it digitally. Diane suddenly said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Monica is incredibly arrogant, Harrison, but she is also deeply paranoid. She does not trust digital encryption alone. When they forced me out, I accidentally intercepted an email from her private architect. I frowned, completely confused. What does her private architect have to do with missing corporate funds? Monica requested the immediate installation of a military-grade biometric floor safe, Diane explained with urgency. She insisted it had to be large enough to hold physical property deeds and financial ledgers. She keeps hard copies of absolutely everything, Harrison. She wants the physical leverage in her own hands, just in case the digital system ever fails her. If we want to find out exactly where your $40 million went, and exactly how they are framing you, we need the contents of that physical safe. My heart began to pound a furious rhythm against my ribs. Where exactly did she install this biometric safe? Diane took a deep breath, delivering the devastating blow. She installed it in the primary master suite of the main estate. The blood completely drained from my face. The main estate. She was talking about my own home, the sprawling mansion in the prestigious Cherry Creek neighborhood. 6 months ago, Preston had convinced me to let him and Monica move into the main house while their own property was supposedly undergoing black mold remediation. I had generously moved myself into the guest wing, completely oblivious to their true intentions. Now I realized the entire renovation story was just another calculated lie designed to get Monica directly inside my home to establish her base of operations. "You are telling me," I said, my voice shaking with a dangerous fury, "that the evidence I need to save my company and my freedom is locked inside a safe sitting in the middle of my own bedroom, while the two people trying to destroy me are currently sleeping in my bed." Diane nodded slowly, her expression grim and resolute. I left Diane at the diner, promising to call the moment I had the documents. The drive back to Cherry Creek took 40 minutes. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. A thick fog swallowed the streetlights, wrapping the sprawling estates in gray mist. I parked my rented sedan 3 blocks away, tucking it behind dense hedges. I approached the wrought iron gates of my property. It was deeply unsettling to approach the home I had built from the ground up as if I were a burglar. Preston overhauled the perimeter security system 3 months ago. He explained the new sensors would provide peace of mind. He was right, assuming I would never bypass it. But my son underestimated my meticulous nature. When contractors installed the central control panel, I secretly requested master override codes from the lead technician. Preston never knew those codes existed. I approached the digital keypad hidden behind a stone pillar near the side gate. I punched in the sequence. The green indicator light flashed silently. The magnetic lock disengaged. I stepped onto the manicured grounds of my estate. The towering silhouette of the mansion loomed ahead in the fog. Every window was dark. The house was completely silent. I moved cautiously across the damp grass, avoiding the gravel pathways to eliminate any crunching sounds. I made my way to the heavy French doors leading into the conservatory. I pulled a specialized electronic key card from my wallet. This was my personal access card coded to the highest clearance level of the old security framework. I prayed Monica had not wiped my legacy credentials from the interior deadbolts. I slid the card into the slot. A tiny mechanical hum vibrated softly. I turned the brass handle and stepped inside. The air conditioning washed over me, carrying the scent of polished mahogany. The house felt entirely foreign. The layout was the same, but the internal energy had shifted. I was a phantom trespassing in a life stolen from me. I moved slowly through the grand foyer, allowing my eyes time to adjust to the shadows. I paused near the base of the double staircase. Above me on the second floor, my son and his treacherous wife were sleeping comfortably in my bed. I could almost hear their breathing drifting down through the cavernous space. The sheer audacity of their betrayal ignited a spark of fury in my chest. I wanted to march up those stairs and demand answers. But unleashing my rage without evidence was exactly what they were counting on. I forced myself to focus on the mission. I turned sharply and walked silently down the long carpeted hallway toward the west wing. This area used to be my private study. When Monica moved in, she immediately claimed the space, gutting my antique oak bookshelves and replacing them with modern glass fixtures. It was now her command center. The heavy door to her renovated home office was firmly closed. I pressed my ear against the cool wood, listening intently for any faint sign of movement. Absolute, terrifying silence. I gently turned the brass knob and pushed the door open. The room was bathed in the pale light of the moon, filtering through the tall, arched windows. The transformation of my beloved study was visually jarring. The dark wood tones had been painted over in sterile shades of white and industrial gray. A sleek glass desk sat perfectly in the center of the room, devoid of any paperwork. Monica was meticulously organized. She left nothing to chance in the open. But Diane had explicitly warned me about her deep paranoia. She desperately needed the comfort of physical leverage. I closed the door softly behind me. I stood perfectly still, letting my eyes sweep the painted walls. Diane had mentioned a massive art piece concealing the safe. My intense gaze landed securely on the far wall. Where my prized collection of first-edition architectural texts used to sit there was now a gigantic abstract painting. It was a chaotic clash of black and dark red brushstrokes that looked out of place against the sterile walls. It was the only item in the entire room that could possibly conceal a military-grade vault. I crossed the room quickly, my footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. I stopped directly in front of the massive painting. It was heavy, framed in thick, brushed steel. I carefully ran my index fingers along the bottom edge of the frame, searching desperately for a hidden latch. My fingertips brushed gently against a small, recessed button hidden perfectly in the bottom right corner. I took a deep, shaky breath, physically steeling myself for what I was about to find. I firmly pressed the button. There was a sharp hydraulic hiss. The massive painting slid smoothly to the left on a cleverly concealed motorized track. My breath caught sharply in my throat. Embedded directly into the heavily reinforced drywall was a gleaming state-of-the-art biometric safe. It was significantly larger than I had anticipated. The heavy steel door was finished in a dull matte black, featuring a complex digital keypad, an advanced retinal scanner, and a highly sensitive fingerprint reader. It looked like something pulled directly out of a high-security government facility. This was the beating heart of the beast. This vault held the detailed blueprint of my financial execution. The physical ledgers, the forged bankruptcy filings, the offshore shadow accounts. Everything Preston and Monica were actively using to dismantle my legacy was sitting right in front of me, locked securely behind 2 thick inches of solid titanium. I stared intensely at the blinking red light of the biometric scanner. Diane had told me about the safe, but neither of us had formulated a plan for bypassing a physical biometric lock. It specifically required Monica's biological data. Something I did not possess. A freezing wave of despair threatened to wash over me. Had I risked everything, broken into my own home, sneaked past my betrayers only to be stopped by a piece of reinforced steel? I placed my hands flat against the cold metal door, searching frantically for any possible physical weakness. I closed my eyes tightly and forced my rising panic down. I had to think logically. I had to remember everything I knew about my daughter-in-law. Monica was terribly paranoid, but she was also deeply vain and predictable. She demanded absolute control over her environment. She would never trust a digital machine entirely. She would always insist on a physical master override key in case the electronics ever failed her. I dropped to my knees, running my hands frantically across the underside of the heavy glass desk. Absolutely nothing. I checked the sleek filing cabinets, pulling the drawers open and feeling deep behind the tracks. Nothing. The digital clock read exactly 2:45 in the morning. Time was rapidly running out. Every second I remained in this house increased the chances of being discovered. If Preston woke up, if the motion sensors caught a passing shadow, my plan would be destroyed. I stood back up and stared at the imposing safe. I needed to find her master key. I needed to find it now. I stared at the black steel door of the biometric vault, my mind racing. I could not search this room for a physical key. It would take hours, and I had mere minutes. I forced my breathing to slow down. I had to think like the man who built this estate. When I constructed this mansion, I employed a specialized security firm to install the internal network. I had demanded a universal analog override for every electronic lock in the house, a deeply embedded numerical sequence that bypassed all biometric scans. It was a fail-safe for catastrophic power failures. Monica had completely renovated the office and upgraded the software, but the physical safe was hardwired directly into the original structural grid of the house. If she used the estate's primary security contractor, the foundational override code might still be active. It was a gamble, but it was my only option. I stepped up to the digital keypad positioned below the retinal scanner. My fingers were trembling. I took a deep breath and began to punch in the sequence. It was a complex 14-digit code based on the exact coordinates of my first commercial property, combined with Beatrice's birth date. I pressed the final number and held my breath. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The red scanner light continued to blink. My heart sank. But then a sharp metallic click echoed loudly. The blinking red light turned solid green. The heavy titanium locking bolts retracted with a deep mechanical groan. I gripped the cold steel handle, twisted it downward, and pulled the heavy door open. The interior of the vault was pitch black. I reached into my jacket pocket and retrieved a tiny LED pen light I had purchased at the gas station. I clicked the button, casting a narrow beam of white light into the cavernous space. I fully expected to find stacks of foreign currency velvet boxes filled with Monica's expensive jewelry, or perhaps offshore banking tokens. Instead, the massive safe was entirely devoid of valuables. It was completely packed with thick, glossy legal folders. I reached inside and pulled out the top stack. The folders were heavy bound with thick rubber bands and marked with complex alphanumeric codes. I carried the heavy stack over to the glass desk, moving as quietly as a ghost, and laid them out under the pale moonlight streaming through the tall windows. I opened the first folder. It was a comprehensive commercial loan agreement. The thick paper felt completely unnatural against my cold skin. I scanned the top of the document. The lender was a private equity firm operating out of the Cayman Islands, a shadow entity with absolutely no recognizable corporate footprint. The principal loan amount was listed at $12 million. I felt a cold chill wash over my skin. Caldwell Commercial Real Estate had strict internal policies regarding international debt. We exclusively used domestic banking partners for our major developments. I flipped rapidly through the thick pages of dense legal jargon, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted clauses. This was not a standard corporate loan. It was an incredibly predatory high-interest debt structure designed to aggressively bleed the borrower dry. And the borrower was not the Caldwell Corporation. I turned to the final signature page, and my blood ran completely cold. Right there on the black line designated for the primary personal guarantor was my signature. It was an absolutely flawless reproduction of my handwriting. The distinct loop of the letter H, the sharp, aggressive slant of my last name. It was an absolutely flawless and perfect replication. But I had definitely never seen this complex document in my entire life. My hands began to shake with a violent, uncontrollable energy. I opened the second folder. It was another loan agreement, this one from a different shadow firm based in Panama, for a staggering $18 million. Again, my signature was perfectly forged on the bottom line, personally guaranteeing the entire massive debt. I frantically tore through the rest of the folders. There were dozens of them. Exactly 20 million, 15 million, 10 million. The horrific reality of their scheme crashed down on me with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. Preston and Monica were not just skimming money off the top of my company. They were systematically taking out tens of millions of dollars in highly illegal, untraceable loans from shadow organizations. They were using my name, my personal credit, and my lifelong reputation as the ultimate collateral. They were quietly funneling the massive influx of cash into their own hidden offshore accounts, intentionally loading my personal financial profile with a catastrophic amount of toxic debt. When the loans inevitably defaulted, these shadow companies would legally seize my private retirement trust, my estate, and every single asset I had ever built to satisfy the missing funds. Preston's conversation at the airport finally made perfect, terrifying sense. He was not liquidating the Silverstone Plaza project. He was using it as a smokescreen to trigger an immediate, orchestrated bankruptcy the moment I landed in Cambodia. He was going to let me take the entire devastating fall, while he and Monica walked away with hundreds of millions in stolen cash. I needed to get these documents to Diane immediately. This was the absolute proof of their incredible corporate treason. I began frantically stuffing the heavy folders into the deep pockets of my trench coat. I grabbed as many as I could physically carry without making a sound. Just as I reached for the final stack of forged agreements, a sudden noise shattered the silence of the house. It was the distinct heavy creak of a wooden floorboard groaning under pressure. The sound came directly from the ceiling right above my head. Someone was awake. The heavy thud of footsteps began moving across the master bedroom, heading toward the grand staircase. It was Preston. He was coming downstairs. Pure adrenaline flooded my system. I shoved the last folder into my jacket, spun around, and aggressively pushed the heavy steel door of the vault closed. It latched with a sharp, terrifying click. I rushed over to the massive abstract painting, grabbed the edge of the brushed steel frame, and shoved it back along its hidden motorized track. It slid into place just as the unmistakable sound of footsteps hit the first landing of the wooden staircase. He was coming down for a glass of water. I sprinted silently across the carpet, slipping out of the renovated home office. I pulled the door shut behind me, leaving the handle perfectly straight. The grand foyer was bathed in shadows. I could hear Preston humming a light, cheerful tune as he walked through the kitchen. I moved like a shadow, pressing myself flat against the cold hallway wall. I reached the French doors of the conservatory, slid my electronic keycard through the slot, and pushed myself out into the biting night air. I closed the glass door softly, just as the bright kitchen lights clicked on inside the house. I had missed him by mere seconds. I disappeared into the thick fog, carrying the weight of my son's ultimate betrayal pressed tightly against my chest. The drive back to the motel was a blur of cold sweat. I parked my rented sedan 2 blocks away from the flickering neon sign. The night air was biting, but I barely felt the chill as I hurried across the cracked asphalt toward room number 7. I knocked twice, paused, and knocked once more. The deadbolt clicked, and the heavy door swung open. Diane was standing there, her face illuminated by the harsh blue glow of her laptop screen. She quickly ushered me inside and locked the door behind me. I did not say a single word. I simply unbuttoned my coat, pulled out the thick, glossy legal folders, and dropped them onto the squeaky mattress. Diane did not ask how I managed to bypass the biometric vault. She grabbed the first stack of documents, adjusted her reading glasses, and began scanning the pages. For the next hour, the only sounds in the dingy motel room were the rhythmic flipping of heavy paper and the passing of a long-haul truck on the distant highway. I paced to the narrow space between the bed and the scratched television stand, my chest tight with anticipation. Finally, Diane let out a shuddering breath and took off her glasses. "It is worse than we thought. Harrison," she said, her voice dropping to a heavy whisper. "These are not just unauthorized lines of credit. These are aggressively structured corporate death warrants." I stopped pacing and stood over the desk. "Explain it to me," I demanded. Diane spread the documents across the faded brown bedspread. "Caldwell Commercial Real Estate is completely profitable, Harrison. The company is generating massive, healthy margins. But Preston and Monica have systematically siphoned exactly $40 million out of our primary operating accounts over the last 8 months. They funneled the cash through a labyrinth of shell companies disguised as third-party contractors for the Silverstone Plaza project. But Silverstone was liquidated." I argued, the frustration bleeding into my voice. "Exactly." Diane nodded sharply. "They used the closed project as a phantom ledger. Once the $40 million was extracted, they replaced the missing capital with highly toxic, unregulated shadow loans. Because they forged your personal signature as the sole guarantor on every single page, the corporate liability is completely shielded. When the balloon payments default, the shadow lenders will immediately seize your private retirement trust." The cold-blooded brilliance of the scheme was paralyzing. Preston was using the company to destroy me. He and Monica were going to walk away with $40 million of untraceable cash, while I was left completely bankrupt and facing federal investigations for catastrophic loan defaults. We have the forged documents, I said, pointing to the bed. We have the proof of their fraud. We can take this directly to the federal authorities tomorrow morning. Diane shook her head, her expression grim. It is not enough, Harrison. Yes, we have the physical contracts, but these shadow lenders are ghost entities. Without direct proof of where that $40 million actually ended up, Preston could easily argue that you authorized these high-risk loans yourself because your signature is physically on the paper. We need to find the final destination of the stolen money. We need the actual communication linking them to the offshore accounts. I reached into the front pocket of my trousers. When I was pulling the folders out of the vault, my knuckles had brushed against something small and hard, tucked into the back corner of the steel shelf. I pulled it out and placed it gently onto the desk next to Diane's laptop. It was a sleek silver USB drive. Diane stared at the small metal rectangle, her eyes widening with profound hope. Harrison, she whispered, tell me you found this inside Monica's biometric safe. It was hidden behind the last stack of loan agreements, I confirmed. Diane grabbed the drive and plugged it into the side port of her laptop. A prompt appeared on the screen demanding a 32-character alphanumeric decryption key. The drive was heavily encrypted, locked behind military-grade security protocols. We are locked out, I said, feeling a bitter wave of disappointment. We do not have her password. Diane cracked a sharp, determined smile. You forget who you are dealing with, Harrison. I was the chief financial officer of a billion-dollar real estate empire. When Preston forced me out, I downloaded the complete archive of our internal network vulnerabilities. Monica thinks she is a digital ghost, but she made the amateur mistake of linking her private encryption keys to her automated calendar reminders. Diane opened a separate terminal window and began typing at a furious pace. Lines of green code cascaded down the black screen. She was running a targeted extraction program, pulling fragmented data from the ghost account she had buried deep within the human resources portal. She cross-referenced the encrypted drive against Monica's archived digital footprint, looking for the microscopic flaws in her perfect security wall. For 20 agonizing minutes, the motel room was filled with the frantic clicking of laptop keys. I watched the screen, holding my breath. Suddenly, the laptop emitted a soft, high-pitched chime. The black terminal window vanished. The desktop flickered, and a massive directory of carefully organized folders populated the screen. We were in. Diane clicked on the first folder labeled Offshore Communications. The screen filled with hundreds of highly sensitive, unredacted email chains. These were private, direct communications between Monica and the anonymous brokers managing the shadow entities in Panama and the Cayman Islands. I leaned over Diane's shoulder, my eyes scanning the harsh, undeniable truth of my family's betrayal. The emails detailed the exact routing numbers, the specific wire transfer protocols, and the complex digital washing mechanisms they used to clean the stolen $40 million. But it was the arrogant tone of Monica's messages that ignited a roaring inferno of pure rage inside my chest. I read a message she had sent to her offshore broker just 3 days ago. The subject line simply read, "The final phase. The old man suspects absolutely nothing," the email read. He is obsessed with his legacy. Preston booked him a 3-week trip to Cambodia. The moment his flight leaves the tarmac, trigger the default clauses on the Panamanian loans. The asset freeze should hit his private trust before he even lands. By the time he figures out how to make an international phone call, his entire empire will legally belong to us, and the $40 million will be permanently secured in the Cayman accounts. He is going to die completely broke. I stared at the glowing screen, reading the words until they burned into my retinas. The sheer cruelty, the absolute lack of any human empathy or familial loyalty was staggering. They wanted to strip away my dignity and leave me rotting in total poverty. Diane slowly closed the laptop screen. She looked up at me, her eyes reflecting the fierce anger currently boiling inside my veins. "We have everything, Harrison," she said, her voice trembling. "We have the location of the stolen $40 million. I slowly smiled. Now it is time to destroy them. Diane did not hesitate. She clicked out of the encrypted offshore email client and opened a new directory nested deep within the shadow drive. This folder was simply labeled with a random series of alphanumeric characters, but the contents were entirely transparent. It was a massive archive of exported chat logs from a secure, anonymous messaging application. Diane quickly ran a complex decryption script she had pulled from her Ghost account, and the scrambled text instantly reorganized itself into clear, highly readable conversations. She leaned closer to the monitor, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. "Harrison," she murmured, her voice tight with absolute disbelief. "You really need to read this immediately. The emails we just saw were only the logistical instructions for the offshore transfers. These private chat logs are the strategic blueprints." I pulled the squeaky metal folding chair closer to the scratched desk, pressing my shoulder firmly against hers, so I could clearly see the glowing text. The chat logs documented a constant daily dialogue between a user handle traced directly back to Monica's personal mobile device and a man identified only as Vargas. Diane ran a rapid background trace on the name using an external corporate database. Within a few seconds, a highly detailed profile appeared. Vargas was a severely corrupt, disbarred attorney, currently operating out of Panama City, known extensively in international financial circles for orchestrating aggressive corporate takeovers and laundering massive sums of illicit wealth. He was a professional ghost, a man who specifically specialized in making stolen money completely disappear. As I slowly read through the thousands of lines of digital text exchanged over the past 8 months, the true hierarchy of this horrific betrayal became glaringly, painfully obvious. Preston, for all his boardroom arrogance and expensive tailored suits, was merely the executive muscle. He was just the inside man leveraging his powerful position as chief operating officer to physically authorize the massive transfers and bypass our internal auditing protocols. But Monica was the undisputed mastermind. She was the one actively pulling the strings, directing Vargas, and designing the incredibly complex labyrinth of shadow-holding companies. She was a master manipulator, hiding her brilliant sociopathic mind behind the polished facade of a wealthy philanthropic socialite. My eyes scanned the glowing lines of text, tracing a specific conversation that had taken place just 48 hours ago. It was the final strategic coordination before my scheduled departure to Cambodia. Monica's digital voice was completely ruthless, entirely devoid of any human empathy or familial affection. The sharp words leaped off the bright screen, striking me with the heavy force of a physical blow. "Once the old fool is on that 20-hour flight, freeze the domestic accounts," she had written. I read the cruel sentence twice, the harsh syllables tasting like bitter ash in my mouth. She referred to me not as her father-in-law, not even by my given name, but simply as the old fool. Diane remained perfectly silent, her right hand trembling slightly as she scrolled down to the next block of text. Vargas had replied asking for final confirmation on the upcoming media strategy. Monica's response was swift, brutal, and devastatingly precise. "Leak the embezzlement to the press immediately," she commanded. "Make sure the financial reporters get the forged documents showing his signature on the massive shadow loans. The world will think Harrison Caldwell stole his own company money and fled to Asia to avoid federal prosecution." My heart completely stopped beating for a terrifying fraction of a second. The sheer, breathtaking scale of her incredible malice suddenly crystallized in my exhausted mind. They were not merely stealing $40 million. They were orchestrating an elaborate, perfectly airtight assassination of my entire character. If I had mindlessly boarded that airplane, I would have landed in Cambodia without a working credit card or access to a single cent of my wealth. But the total financial ruin was only the very beginning of the living nightmare. I would have landed as a wanted international fugitive. By the time I managed to connect to a foreign cellular network, the American media would be broadcasting my face across every major news channel. The bold headlines would declare that the aging billionaire founder of Caldwell Commercial Real Estate had emptied his own corporate coffers, deliberately bankrupted his beloved company, and escaped to a non-extradition country to live out his days in stolen luxury. The sheer cruelty of the master plan left me completely breathless. 40 years of my entire life had been utterly dedicated to building that specific company from a single rented desk into a towering corporate empire. 40 years of honest business dealings, generous charitable foundations, strong civic leadership, and a perfectly spotless reputation. All of it was scheduled to be violently burned to the absolute ground before the sun rose tomorrow morning. I would have been completely trapped in a foreign jungle, entirely unable to legally defend myself, while my face became instantly synonymous with corporate greed and criminal cowardice. I stared at the glowing laptop screen, my mind reeling from the horrible realization. Why would she go to such extreme, incredibly destructive lengths? Why not simply steal the $40 million and quietly run away? The answer was pure, unadulterated greed and a desperate, burning need for absolute power. By intentionally framing me as a cowardly criminal, Monica and Preston could smoothly step into the public spotlight as the tragic, heroic successors. They would cleverly play the innocent victims for the national press, promising to save the devastated company from the smoking ruins of my supposed madness. They would seize complete control of the remaining corporate assets, write off the stolen millions as my personal theft, and emerge as the ultimate saviors of the Caldwell legacy. Diane typed furiously, executing a rapid series of complex commands to safely download and fully secure the damning chat logs onto her own encrypted hard drive. She looked at me, her brown eyes reflecting the harsh blue light of the computer monitor. "They are absolute monsters. Harrison," she whispered, her voice thick with total disgust. "They did not just want to rob you blind. They wanted to deeply humiliate you. They wanted to completely erase your legacy and rewrite history with you as the ultimate villain." I looked down at my hands, the exact same hands that had carried heavy bricks on my very first construction sites, the hands that had drafted architectural blueprints late into the night. They were perfectly steady. The initial shock and the paralyzing tremor of familial betrayal had entirely vanished. The profound heartbreak of realizing my only son was a willing traitor was swiftly replaced by the cold, hardened steel of a man fighting for his literal survival. This was no longer a simple family dispute. This was not a tragic corporate misunderstanding. This was a highly calculated, lethal declaration of war against my life, my freedom, and my good name. I took a deep, centering breath, letting the freezing, stale air so completely fill my burning lungs. The heavy emotional fog completely cleared from my racing mind. I was completely ready to destroy them both, completely and entirely, right now. I watched Diane turn her attention back to the glowing screen. The harsh blue light illuminated the deep lines of concentration on her face. If we were going to utterly destroy them, we needed to understand the foundation of their entire operation. We had the chat logs, we had the forged loan agreements, but a massive piece of the puzzle was still missing. Legitimate private equity firms, even those operating in offshore tax havens, do not aggressively loan tens of millions of dollars to a real estate company without conducting a rigorous corporate audit. They do not accept a single personal guarantor without a face-to-face verification. Diane began to run a trace on the initial origin of the funds. She isolated the routing numbers from the Panamanian shadow lender and fed them into a highly advanced global tracking matrix. We sat in the dim motel room watching the digital map ping across different continents. The money had moved through a dizzying maze of digital wallets bouncing from Europe to the Caribbean to South America. But Diane was relentless. She peeled back the encrypted layers one by one, looking for the very first point of origin. After 30 minutes of intense digital excavation, the matrix stopped spinning. A single location flashed on the screen. It was not an international banking hub. It was Las Vegas, Nevada. I stared at the blinking red dot on the map. Las Vegas made absolutely no sense in the context of international commercial real estate finance. I asked Diane to dig deeper into the specific holding company that initiated the transfer. She ran the corporate registration through a restricted federal database she still had access to from her days as my chief financial officer. The results populated on the screen in stark, undeniable terms. The entity was not a bank. It was not a hedge fund. It was a known front for a highly organized, extremely violent underground credit syndicate. The air in the room suddenly felt 20 degrees colder. My son was not borrowing money from aggressive venture capitalists. He was taking tens of millions of dollars from a criminal cartel. The sheer magnitude of his stupidity was almost impossible to comprehend. I had raised a boy with every conceivable advantage. He had attended the finest business schools. He had inherited a seat at the executive table of a billion-dollar empire. There was absolutely no logical reason for him to seek financing from a murderous syndicate operating out of the Nevada desert. There has to be a motive, I told Diane, keeping my voice low and steady to mask the rising panic in my chest. Preston has access to legitimate capital. He has a massive corporate salary. He does not need shadow loans. Find out where his personal money went. Diane nodded and opened a new search window. She utilized the access codes we had pulled from Monica's decrypted files to bypass the security on Preston's private digital accounts. She began to dissect his financial history over the last 3 years. The picture that emerged was not one of a brilliant corporate strategist. It was the desperate, chaotic ledger of a severe gambling addict. Preston had not been managing the company during his frequent business trips to the West Coast. He had been spending weeks locked inside exclusive, unlisted underground casinos. Diane pulled up the transaction logs. My son had been hemorrhaging money at a terrifying rate. He was dropping hundreds of thousands of dollars on single hands of high-stakes poker. When his personal bank accounts ran dry, he turned to highly volatile cryptocurrency markets, desperately trying to win back his catastrophic losses. But the markets crashed. The digital coins he had heavily invested in lost their entire value practically overnight. Diane highlighted the final devastating sum at the bottom of the spreadsheet. Preston had lost exactly $20 million. He was completely broke. He had liquidated his own trust funds. He had secretly sold his shares of stock. He had absolutely nothing left. And he owed $20 million to a cartel that did not accept apologies or delayed payment plans. I stared at the staggering number, feeling a sickening mixture of rage and profound pity. The flawless tailored suits, the expensive watches, the confident boardroom presentations. It was all a hollow shell. My son was a desperate, drowning man, completely suffocated by a mountain of illegal debt. He had backed himself into a corner with ruthless criminals who routinely murdered people for a fraction of that amount. And that is when Monica stepped in, Diane whispered, piecing the horrible truth together. She did not marry a billionaire heir. She married a massive liability. When the syndicate demanded their money, she realized her entire lifestyle was about to violently collapse. So she designed a way to pay them back using your empire. The sheer mechanics of the operation were brutally ingenious. The syndicate did not just want their $20 million returned. They needed a secure, legitimate channel to wash their dirty money. Monica offered them Caldwell Commercial Real Estate as the ultimate washing machine. She and Preston fabricated the massive shadow loans. The cartel injected their dirty cash into my company under the guise of commercial project financing. Monica then structured the outgoing payments as phantom consulting fees, cleaning the money show and sending it back to the cartel with Preston's massive debt securely factored into the transaction. They were using my pristine corporate infrastructure to launder tens of millions of dollars for organized crime. And to completely insulate themselves from the inevitable federal fallout, they had forged my signature on every single document. They were actively paying off a blood debt by feeding my entire life to the wolves. The revelation fundamentally altered the landscape of my survival. I was no longer just fighting against a greedy son and a sociopathic daughter-in-law. I was completely entangled in the crosshairs of a violent cartel. If I simply marched into a police station and reported the fraud, the syndicate would immediately realize their washing machine had been compromised. They would not wait for a lengthy federal trial. They would eliminate the loose ends. They would silence Preston, Monica, and me before the authorities could even file the initial indictments. "We cannot just hand this over to the federal authorities," Diane said, mirroring my exact thoughts. Her face was pale, reflecting the true danger of our situation. If the cartel senses an investigation, they will erase everyone involved. We are dealing with people who make corporate executives disappear permanently. She was absolutely right. The standard legal channels were entirely useless. A simple police report would be a literal death sentence. If I wanted to survive this, if I wanted to reclaim my company and protect my own life, I had to be infinitely smarter, faster, and more ruthless than the criminals currently operating inside my boardroom. I stood up from the squeaky metal chair and began pacing the short length of the motel room. The walls felt like they were closing in. I had 48 hours before the cartel triggered the massive loan defaults. I had 48 hours before the international media declared me a cowardly fugitive. I had 48 hours to dismantle an operation designed by a sociopath and funded by the mob. I stopped pacing and turned to face Diane. "We need to cut the head off the snake," I told her, my voice completely devoid of any remaining paternal affection. "We cannot go to the police and we cannot fight a cartel directly, but we can completely sever their access to the money. If we destroy the washing machine, Preston and Monica will have absolutely nothing left to offer them." Diane looked at me, her sharp mind already processing the logistical requirements of my terrifying proposal. "You want to sabotage your own company?" she asked, her voice a mixture of awe and fear. "I am going to burn their entire digital infrastructure to the ground," I replied, staring at the glowing laptop screen. "I am going to drain the holding accounts, erase the phantom ledgers, and completely vaporize their ability to transfer a single cent. I will force them to face the cartel empty-handed, and I need you to help me pull the trigger." Diane stared at me for a long moment. She slowly nodded, her hands returning to the keyboard. "If we do this, Harrison, there is absolutely no turning back," she warned softly. I stood behind her, watching the green cursor blink against the black terminal screen. "There has been no turning back since they forged my name," I replied. "Do it." Diane launched a series of aggressive financial override protocols. Because Monica possessed such massive arrogance, she had linked the offshore shadow accounts directly to the central ledger for seamless transfers. Diane used the biometric master codes I had retrieved from the physical safe to validate her access. It took her exactly 14 minutes to bypass the secondary firewalls. "We are inside the Panamanian holding accounts," she announced, her fingers flying across the keys. "I am seeing the entire 40 million sitting in a volatile offshore trust. Drain it," I commanded. "Reroute every single cent back into the primary corporate treasury. Flag the incoming transfer as a highly secure anonymous capital injection to trigger the federal banking delays. It will lock the funds in a mandatory 72-hour holding pattern. The cartel will not be able to touch it, and Preston will have absolutely no way to access the cash." Diane typed the complex routing numbers. A progress bar appeared on the screen. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. The percentage climbed slowly. 10%, 40%, 80%. Finally, a bright green confirmation box popped up. "The money is gone," Diane whispered, letting out a long, shaky breath. "The offshore accounts are completely empty. The shadow lenders have zero capital left in those specific wallets." "Now," I said, leaning closer to the monitor, "destroy the digital paper trail, erase the phantom ledgers from the internal servers. Make it look like a catastrophic database failure isolated entirely to the Silverstone Plaza project files." Diane executed a targeted data wipe. We watched as months of meticulous, fraudulent accounting vanished into the digital void. We successfully severed the connection between the cartel cash and my legitimate company. Preston and Monica were now holding a massive debt with absolutely no corporate collateral and no stolen money to pay it off. They were completely exposed. The digital clock on the bedside table read 5:30 in the morning. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a weak gray light through the motel blinds. My flight to Cambodia was scheduled to depart in exactly 2 hours. Preston and Monica would be waking up right now, expecting to receive confirmation that I had boarded the plane and their trap had been sprung. I gathered the physical loan agreements from the bed and packed them carefully into my leather briefcase. I turned to Diane. "I am going back to the house," I told her calmly. Diane looked at me with genuine concern. Harrison, they are desperate criminals. If they realize what you have done, they might become violent. I shook my head, buttoning my trench coat. They are cowards, Diane. They operate in the shadows because they are terrified of the light. It is time to turn the lights on. I drove back to the Cherry Creek estate as the morning traffic began to build. The neighborhood was quiet and pristine. I parked my car directly in the circular driveway, abandoning any pretense of stealth. I walked up the marble steps and unlocked the massive front doors with my original brass key. The house smelled of fresh espresso. They were awake. I walked deliberately into the formal dining room. Preston and Monica were sitting at the long mahogany table. Preston was wearing a crisp white bathrobe, sipping his coffee while scrolling through a tablet. Monica was typing rapidly on her mobile phone, completely absorbed in her digital world. They both froze the exact moment I stepped into the room. The blood drained instantly from the face of my son. He dropped his tablet onto the table with a loud clatter. "Dad," he stammered, his voice cracking. "What are you doing here? You are supposed to be at the airport. Your flight to Asia departs in less than an hour." I pulled out one of the heavy dining chairs and sat down at the head of the table. I placed my thick leather briefcase onto the polished wood. I decided to cancel my trip. I said, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly level. I realized there were some urgent corporate matters that required my immediate personal attention. Monica slowly lowered her phone. Her perfectly manicured hands were trembling slightly. "What corporate matters, Harrison?" she asked, trying desperately to maintain her composed socialite facade. "Everything is running perfectly under the management of Preston. You have nothing to worry about." I unlatched the briefcase and pulled out the thick stack of forged loan agreements. I tossed them onto the center of the table. They hit the wood with a heavy, definitive thud. "I am worried about $20 million in illicit shadow loans from a Panamanian credit syndicate," I replied, staring directly into her terrified eyes. "I am particularly worried about my signature being perfectly forged as the personal guarantor on every single page." Preston physically recoiled as if I had struck him. He looked at the documents, then looked at Monica in absolute suffocating panic. Monica opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The arrogant, calculating mastermind had completely vanished. "I also had a very productive morning reviewing your private offshore communications," I continued, letting the silence stretch tightly between us. "I read all about your brilliant plan to freeze my domestic accounts and leak a fabricated embezzlement story to the press. I know everything about Vargas. I know about the underground casinos in Las Vegas. I know that you lost $20 million of cartel money, Preston." Preston buried his face in his hands, letting out a pathetic, broken sob. "Dad, please," he begged, his voice muffled by his shaking fingers. "They were going to kill me. I did not have a choice. I needed the company to wash the money." "You always have a choice," I stated coldly, feeling absolutely no pity for the sobbing man across from me. "You chose to frame your own father. You chose to feed my entire legacy to violent criminals to save your own pathetic life." Monica suddenly stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. "This is insane," she shouted, her voice shrill with rising hysteria. "We can just initiate the transfers right now. We can finalize the payments and walk away. You cannot stop the digital protocols, Harrison. The money is already programmed to move." I smiled. It was a cold, humorless expression. "I am afraid you are deeply mistaken, Monica," I told her. "The offshore holding accounts are completely empty. I drained every single cent of the $40 million back into a secure, federally monitored corporate treasury. I also completely erased your phantom ledgers from the internal servers. Your washing machine is broken." Monica physically stumbled backward, clutching the edge of the table for support. "You drained the accounts," she whispered in pure horror. "The syndicate is expecting their first balloon payment by noon today. If the money is not there, they will come looking for us. They will kill us both." "That sounds like a personal problem," I replied, picking up my briefcase and standing up from the table. "I strongly suggest you start packing your bags. The authorities have already been notified about the forged documents. The police are on their way to escort you off my property. You have exactly 10 minutes to leave my house before they arrive." Preston looked up at me, his eyes wide with absolute terror. "Dad, you cannot just abandon us to the cartel. We are family. You have to help us." I looked down at the son I had raised, the boy I had given the entire world to. "Family protects each other." "Preston," I said softly. "Family does not forge signatures and plot assassinations. You are no longer my son. You are just a criminal who made a terrible gamble and lost everything." I turned my back on them and walked out of the dining room, leaving them entirely alone to face the devastating consequences of their own monstrous greed. I stepped out into the crisp morning air, pulling the heavy front doors shut behind me. The solid thud echoed across the circular driveway, marking the definitive end of my family. I walked toward my rented sedan, my posture rigid, my face a mask of absolute stone. I did not look back at the grand estate I had built. I slid into the leather driver's seat, started the engine, and drove away from Cherry Creek. I drove aimlessly for miles, navigating the awakening city streets without any destination in mind. Eventually, I found myself pulling into the empty parking lot of the dilapidated diner where I had met Diane. I turned off the ignition. The oppressive silence of the car wrapped around me, and the massive flood of adrenaline finally began to recede. It hit me all at once. The sheer crushing reality of what had just transpired collapsed onto my chest. I gripped the leather steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. A guttural sob tore through my throat, a sound I did not even recognize as my own. I wept for the little boy I had carried on my shoulders. I wept for the proud father who had stood beaming at a college graduation. I wept for the beautiful illusion of a loving family that I had so desperately protected. It was a visceral, agonizing morning. In that quiet car, the man who was merely a father completely died. He was buried under a mountain of forged signatures, cartel debts, and unimaginable betrayal. I let the hot tears fall freely, grieving the loss of my only son. The innocent child who used to look up to me with complete trust had effectively died the moment he decided to forge my name. He was gone, replaced by a cowardly stranger willing to send me to slaughter. For 20 minutes, I allowed the profound heartbreak to run its natural course. I allowed the raw pain to thoroughly wash over me completely, washing away any lingering, pathetic shreds of false denial. But as the morning sun breached the horizon, casting sharp rays of light through the windshield, the tears stopped. The deep, agonizing grief rapidly began to burn away. In its place, a freezing, absolute clarity settled over my mind. The sorrow calcified into pure, unadulterated fury. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The devastated, heartbroken father was permanently gone. Staring back at me was the ruthless, calculating architect of Caldwell Commercial Real Estate. The man who had crushed powerful competitors, navigated brutal market crashes, and built a billion-dollar empire from a single desk. Preston had wildly underestimated the very man who gave him his entire life. He believed my age equated to weakness. He mistook my paternal patience for corporate complacency. He had forgotten who he was dealing with. I was not a fragile old man waiting to be pushed into the shadows. I was the undisputed apex predator of my entire competitive industry, and my company was currently under a direct, hostile attack. I refused to simply roll over and let a pair of greedy amateurs steal the legacy I had sacrificed my adult life to create. I started the engine and drove straight back to the motel. The drive felt entirely different now. Every movement was precise, every thought sharply focused on absolute survival. When I walked back into room number 7, Diane was sitting at the scratched desk, her eyes wide with apprehension. "Are you all right?" she asked, carefully, studying the hardened lines of my face. "I have never been better," I replied, my voice carrying the crisp, authoritative tone of a chief executive stepping into the boardroom. "The familial ties are severed. Preston and Monica are entirely on their own. Now we secure the perimeter and execute the counter-offensive. Diane immediately straightened her posture visibly, recognizing the incredibly distinct fundamental shift in my demeanor. The CEO had returned. "What are your orders, Harrison?" she asked, her fingers hovering over the laptop keyboard. "We need to legally and publicly completely dismantle Preston," I instructed, pacing the narrow floor with renewed, terrifying energy. "The cartel will target him because he is the one who lost their money, but we must ensure my absolute distance from his toxic fallout. First, compile a comprehensive, irrefutable dossier of his embezzlement. I want every single forged signature, every fraudulent shadow loan agreement, and every single encrypted digital communication between Monica and Vargas perfectly and neatly organized. We are going to hand-deliver this dossier to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the major financial press simultaneously. We will control the narrative from the very first second." Diane nodded sharply, pulling up the decrypted files. "What about the domestic corporate accounts?" she asked. "Initiate a full, immediate corporate lockdown," I commanded. "Contact our primary domestic banking partners. Use my master founder credentials to completely freeze all executive operating accounts. I want Preston physically locked out of the entire building. Send an emergency directive to corporate security. His access badge is revoked. His executive authority is instantly terminated, and he is banned from setting foot on any Caldwell property. I want him isolated, desperate, and entirely cut off from my resources." I pulled the squeaky motel chair out and sat down next to Diane, watching her execute the commands with ruthless efficiency. "We are finally going to aggressively purge the infection. Draft a highly formal aggressive press release to be publicly issued exactly at noon today. It will state that Caldwell Commercial Real Estate has uncovered a massive unauthorized financial scheme perpetrated by a rogue executive. It will announce my immediate return from supposed retirement to retake the position of Chief Executive Officer. We will assure our investors that the core assets remain completely untouched and perfectly profitable. We will offer absolute transparency to the federal regulators." Diane typed furiously, her eyes reflecting the tactical brilliance of the plan. By publicly exposing Preston as a rogue criminal, we instantly sever the cartel leverage over the company. The federal spotlight will act as a shield against any physical retaliation. The syndicate cannot use Caldwell as a washing machine if the federal authorities are crawling all over the financial ledgers. Preston will be left standing alone in the crosshairs, holding a $20 million debt with zero protection. He thought he could outmaneuver the man who built the very foundation he stands on. He thought he could steal my legacy and frame me for his monumental failures. I reached firmly for my mobile phone, completely ready to make the absolutely necessary emergency calls to my entire board of directors. The profound emotional pain of completely losing a son was a heavy, devastating burden. But the absolute necessity of survival demanded total, unwavering focus. I had built an empire with my bare hands, and I was fully prepared to burn my own blood to the ground to protect it. The makeshift war room was active, the legal strategy was perfectly set, and the complete utter destruction of my betrayers was now only a matter of rapidly diminishing time. I did not waste a single second savoring the anticipation of revenge. Revenge is a messy, emotional impulse, and I needed absolute surgical precision. Diane and I spent the next 3 hours meticulously compiling the digital files, printing every unredacted chat log, and indexing the physical loan agreements I had extracted from Monica's biometric safe. We packed everything into 2 heavy reinforced briefcases. The morning sun was fully up now, casting harsh light over the dingy motel room, but my mind was completely clear. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct emergency contact number for a highly connected corporate attorney I had kept on retainer for decades, a man who possessed deep established ties within the federal government. I briefly explained the sheer magnitude of the situation, emphasizing the involvement of the underground credit syndicate. He grasped the catastrophic severity instantly. Within 40 minutes, he had arranged an emergency, off-the-books meeting at a secure federal building in downtown Denver. We left the motel without looking back. Diane drove my rented sedan while I sat in the passenger seat, keeping my hands resting firmly on top of the briefcases. The drive into the city was tense, dominated by a heavy, profound silence. We were carrying enough explosive evidence to topple a billion-dollar corporation and put my own flesh and blood behind bars for the rest of his natural life. We pulled into the subterranean parking garage of a heavily fortified federal plaza. My attorney was already waiting for us near the private service elevator. He did not offer any empty platitudes or hollow words of comfort. He simply scanned his security credentials, and we ascended to a restricted floor entirely dedicated to financial crimes and organized syndicate operations. We were escorted into a stark, windowless conference room, equipped with advanced recording devices and sterile, bright fluorescent lighting. 5 individuals were waiting for us around a long, cold steel table. 2 were senior agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specializing in complex corporate racketeering. The other 3 belonged to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, federal experts trained specifically to hunt down international money laundering operations. They looked at me with a mixture of intense scrutiny and professional skepticism. They fully expected a desperate, guilty billionaire attempting to negotiate a favorable plea deal. I did not give them the opportunity to make assumptions. I sat down, unlatched the heavy briefcases, and spread the physical documents directly across the center of the table. I placed the decrypted offshore chat logs directly beside the forged Panamanian loan agreements. I did not raise my voice, and I did not ask for pity. I simply laid out the entire horrific architecture of my son's betrayal. I explained how Preston had utilized his position as chief operating officer to systematically bleed Caldwell Commercial Real Estate of $40 million. I detailed his catastrophic gambling losses in Las Vegas and the violent cartel he had desperately indebted himself to. I then directed their attention to the digital logs exposing Monica as the brilliant sociopathic mastermind who had engineered the elaborate washing machine to funnel illicit funds through our phantom domestic projects. The federal agents listened in absolute stunned silence. The sheer audacity of the scheme was staggering even to seasoned investigators. When the lead FBI agent finally picked up the physical loan documents, his eyes narrowed sharply at the signature line. He looked at me, questioning my direct involvement. I immediately handed him an independent, digitally certified handwriting analysis that Diane had pulled from our legacy corporate archives, definitively proving the signature on the illicit loans was a flawless, meticulous forgery. The heavy atmosphere in the sterile room shifted dramatically and permanently. The agents were no longer looking at a potential suspect. They were looking at a highly cooperative, incredibly valuable victim who had just handed them the golden key to dismantling a massive, elusive international syndicate. The FinCEN investigators immediately seized the routing numbers Diane had extracted, plugging them into their secure federal mainframes. Within 10 minutes, they verified the exact digital pathway the stolen money had taken, confirming the direct link to the Las Vegas cartel. The lead prosecutor turned to my attorney, acknowledging the unprecedented value of the proactive evidence I had provided. Because I had brought the entire conspiracy into the light, because I had independently secured the irrefutable proof of the forgery, before the cartel could trigger the default, they offered me complete unconditional immunity. My company would be shielded from asset forfeiture, and my personal legacy would remain perfectly intact. But immunity was not enough for me. I needed the infection permanently removed from my life. The federal agents quickly realized that Preston and Monica were entirely unaware that their digital infrastructure had been compromised. They still believed the $40 million was safely sitting in the offshore holding accounts, waiting for the final scheduled transfer to the syndicate brokers. This presented an extraordinary tactical opportunity. The lead FBI agent outlined a massive coordinated trap. We would not alert Preston or Monica. We would let them continue operating under their false sense of absolute security. The Federal Cyber Division would secretly monitor the compromised offshore accounts, waiting for the exact moment the cartel brokers attempted to finalize the massive withdrawal. It was the perfect, inescapable snare. The plan required me to maintain absolute silence. I had to let Preston believe his masterstroke was still in motion. I had to let him think I was completely oblivious, wandering aimlessly around a foreign country, while he prepared to seize my entire empire. The federal agents instructed me to disappear temporarily, to check into a highly secure, undisclosed safe house under federal protection until the trap snapped shut. They needed Preston and Monica to physically attempt the final authorization but from their command center inside my Cherry Creek estate. That final desperate digital keystroke would be the absolute undeniable proof of their direct knowing participation in the cartel money laundering operation. It would provide the feds with the exact legal justification required to raid the mansion and arrest them both on federal racketeering charges. I agreed to the terms without a single moment of hesitation. I watched the federal agents carefully bag the forged documents and the decrypted flash drives into secure evidence containers. They were taking possession of the nightmare that had nearly destroyed my life. I stood up from the cold steel table, shaking the hand of the lead investigator. The profound, suffocating weight that had settled on my chest since I first discovered the betrayal was finally lifting. I walked out of the federal building with Diane right by my side. We stepped out into the warm, bright afternoon sunlight together. The war was no longer fought in the shadows of a dark motel room. The full crushing weight of the United States government was now actively bearing down on the two people who thought they could casually discard me. Preston and Monica had built their arrogant, fragile house of cards on the assumption that I was a weak, blind old man. They were about to discover the highly devastating, inescapable price of that fatal miscalculation today. The transition to the federal safe house was a blur of unmarked vehicles and highly secure underground parking garages. Diane and I were escorted into a remarkably sterile, windowless apartment located somewhere in the sprawling suburban outskirts of the city. The space was instantly transformed into a high-tech federal command center. Heavily armed tactical agents monitored the perimeter, while cyber technicians set up rows of glowing monitors across the small dining table. For 3 grueling days, we sat in complete isolation, watching the digital snare slowly tighten. The agents had established secure taps into the primary surveillance feeds of both my corporate headquarters and my Cherry Creek estate. We watched Preston and Monica move through their days with nauseating confidence. They were entirely oblivious to the invisible federal net completely surrounding them. Friday evening finally arrived. The atmosphere inside the cramped safe house crackled with extreme, suffocating tension. This was the exact night Preston and Monica had selected to execute their grand public performance. They were hosting a wildly extravagant corporate gala at the downtown Ritz-Carlton. The event was entirely funded by my company treasury, costing a staggering $500,000. It was officially billed as a reassurance summit for our most elite investors and prominent media contacts. The lead federal agent handed me a secure tablet streaming a live high-definition video feed directly from the hotel ballroom. Undercover operatives had seamlessly infiltrated the catering staff and the audiovisual production team. I stared at the vibrant screen, watching the absolute pinnacle of my son and his treacherous wife celebrating their supposed victory. The grand ballroom was a sickening display of profound, unmatched corporate gluttony. Towering arrangements of imported white orchids rested on every single table. Waiters in pristine tuxedos circulated through the dense crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of premium vintage champagne. A classical string quartet played soft, soothing melodies from a raised velvet platform. It was a brilliant, flawless theatrical production designed to project absolute stability and immense wealth to a terrified room of wealthy stakeholders. Monica was holding court near the grand entrance, wearing a stunning, custom-tailored black designer gown. She was playing the role of the devastated, deeply supportive daughter-in-law with terrifying perfection. I watched her place a perfectly manicured hand over her heart, offering somber, practiced smiles to the worried investors who approached her. She wiped away non-existent tears, speaking softly about the immense tragedy of my supposed cognitive decline. Her performance was absolutely chilling. She was a master manipulator, effortlessly twisting the narrative to completely isolate my legacy. Preston stood nearby, completely surrounded by aggressive financial journalists and anxious board members. He wore a sharp, dark charcoal suit, looking the part of the reluctant, heroic successor, taking the heavy reins of a broken empire. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance radiating from his posture made my stomach turn. He frequently checked his expensive platinum watch. He believed that at this exact moment, my international flight was making its final descent into the humid darkness of Cambodia. He fully believed I was walking blindly off a plane and directly into the waiting, violent hands of a ruthless credit syndicate. He thought his massive, deadly problem was currently being permanently erased on the other side of the planet. I watched him casually sip his champagne, completely unaware that his every single movement was being recorded by federal agents. The lead investigator tapped my shoulder and pointed to a secondary monitor displaying a complex digital map. The cyber division had successfully isolated the offshore ping from the Las Vegas cartel. The underground syndicate brokers were actively attempting to initiate the massive withdrawal from the shadow-holding accounts. The digital trap was primed. We just needed Preston and Monica to officially spring it. The ballroom lights suddenly dimmed. A single, bright spotlight illuminated the main stage. The soft chatter of the wealthy crowd rapidly faded into total silence. Preston handed his empty champagne flute to a passing waiter and walked slowly up the carpeted steps. He adjusted the microphone with a heavy, dramatic sigh. He looked out over the sea of expectant faces, allowing a perfectly timed moment of absolute silence to stretch across the massive room. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with manufactured grief. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began, his tone projecting deep, painful reluctance. "We gathered you here this evening because Caldwell Commercial Real Estate is facing an unprecedented, deeply tragic crisis. It breaks my heart to stand before you today and announce the fundamental restructuring of our entire executive board." He paused, looking down at his hands, playing the devastated sun to absolute perfection. I watched the live feed from the cold safe house, feeling a profound, absolute void where my paternal love used to reside. "As many of you know, my father built this company from nothing." Preston continued, his voice echoing loudly through the ballroom speakers. He was a visionary. But recently, his mental health began to severely, rapidly decline. We tried desperately to manage his condition privately. But yesterday we uncovered a catastrophic breach of trust. My father abused his foundational executive authority. He secretly siphoned $40 million from our primary operating accounts into untraceable offshore holdings. The crowd erupted into loud, frantic gasps. Camera flashes exploded around the stage, illuminating Preston in a sea of blinding white light. He held up his hands, begging for calm. "I know this is incredibly difficult to hear," he said, his voice trembling with fake emotion. "We believe my father has fled the country to avoid federal prosecution. He has abandoned his family and his legacy. But I promise you, this company will survive. My wife and I are stepping up. We are personally guaranteeing the core assets. We will navigate this dark storm and return Caldwell Commercial Real Estate to its former glory. I promise you absolute transparency and unwavering dedication." The sheer audacity of his speech was absolutely breathtaking. He was publicly declaring me a coward and a thief, while actively seeking the praise of the very people he was simultaneously robbing. Monica joined him on the brightly lit stage, wrapping her arm around his waist in a show of profound, unified strength. The room burst into thunderous, supportive applause. They were entirely convinced by the flawless, sickening deception. I stared at the tablet, my face entirely devoid of any emotion. Diane sat next to me, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "They actually think they won," she whispered, shaking her head in complete disbelief. "They think they are totally untouchable." I looked away from the live video feed and turned toward the lead federal investigator standing near the heavy door. The senior investigator received a silent, urgent communication through his tactical earpiece. He looked directly at me and offered a single sharp nod. The offshore syndicate brokers had officially initiated the primary withdrawal sequence. The massive digital transfer was demanding a final physical biometric authorization from the primary account holders. The entire massive scheme was finally reaching the critical, undeniable flashpoint. "It is time," I told the lead federal agent calmly. "Spring the trap exactly right now." The lead federal agent pressed 2 fingers to his earpiece and issued a single decisive command to the tactical teams waiting in the shadows. "Go." That single syllable was the absolute death knell for my son. I stood up from the folding chair in the safe house, smoothing the lapels of my dark custom-tailored suit. I had dressed for an execution. Diane stood beside me, handing me my heavy wool overcoat. She offered a tight, solemn smile. "It is time to reclaim your empire, Harrison," she said softly. I thanked her, stepped out of the sterile apartment, and walked down to the waiting black sport utility vehicle. 2 armed agents escorted me into the spacious back seat. The drive back into the heart of downtown Denver was swift and silent. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, reflecting the cold, calculated fury that had entirely consumed my heart. I was no longer a grieving father. I was a man who had been pushed to the absolute brink of destruction, and I was about to return the favor with catastrophic interest. We pulled into the subterranean loading dock of the Ritz-Carlton. A dozen federal agents wearing dark suits and discreet earpieces were already moving with absolute synchronized precision. They had secured the entire lower perimeter, sealing every single exit from the grand ballroom above. The trap was locked. There was absolutely no way out. The lead agent led me toward the private service elevators. We ascended to the mezzanine level in complete silence. The air grew thick with the muffled sounds of the extravagant gala taking place just down the corridor. As the elevator doors slid open, I could hear Preston. His voice was amplified by the massive sound system echoing down the long carpeted hallway. He was right in the middle of his sickening performance. He was actively describing the profound heartbreak of a son forced to clean up the catastrophic mess left behind by a criminal, cowardly father. I walked slowly down the corridor, my expensive leather shoes making no sound against the thick, plush carpet. 2 federal agents walked 3 paces behind me, their presence a silent, terrifying promise of the justice about to be delivered. I stopped right outside the massive, heavy mahogany doors leading directly into the main ballroom. I could hear the wealthy investors murmuring in sympathetic agreement with Preston. I could picture Monica standing right beside him, projecting her flawless, supportive facade. They were bathing in the stolen spotlight, fully believing they had successfully orchestrated the perfect, undeniable corporate coup. They believed I was currently shivering in a foreign country, completely terrified, and waiting for a violent cartel assassin to find me. The absolute arrogance of their assumption fueled my every step. I placed my hands flat against the polished wood of the heavy double doors. I took one final deep breath, letting the freezing clarity of absolute power wash over my entire body. I pushed the heavy mahogany doors open with tremendous violent force. They swung wide and slammed loudly against the interior walls, producing a sharp, explosive sound that instantly shattered the reverent atmosphere of the ballroom. The heavy, dramatic noise echoed like a gunshot. The entire sea of wealthy investors, board members, and eager financial journalists universally turned their heads toward the back of the room. The absolute suffocating silence that instantly fell over the massive space was heavy enough to crush stone. I stood perfectly still in the wide doorway. The bright, harsh chandeliers reflected off the pristine fabric of my sharp, dark suit. I did not look like a broken, cowardly fugitive. I radiated absolute, undeniable authority. I was the true, undisputed patriarch of Caldwell Commercial Real Estate, and I had returned to my rightful throne. My eyes locked immediately onto the brightly lit stage. Preston was standing frozen at the podium. He had been right in the middle of wiping a perfectly timed fake tear from his cheek. His hand hovered uselessly in the air. All the color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified, hollow ghost. He physically swayed, grabbing the edges of the wooden podium just to keep himself standing. Beside him, Monica let out a short, high-pitched gasp of pure, unadulterated horror. Her confident, manipulative mask completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Her dark eyes went wide with a profound, primitive panic as she stared directly at the man she truly believed she had permanently buried. I began my long, deliberate walk down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The massive crowd of elites automatically parted for me like a terrified flock of sheep. I did not look at any of them. I kept my freezing, relentless gaze permanently fixed on the trembling coward standing on the stage. The only sound in the entire room was the steady, rhythmic clicking of my leather shoes against the floor. Every single step I took drove another heavy nail directly into the coffin of their elaborate, deceitful conspiracy. The federal agents filtered into the room behind me quietly and efficiently, securing every single exit door. I reached the carpeted steps leading up to the main stage. I walked up them with smooth, practiced ease. Preston was physically shaking. His breathing was rapid and shallow. He looked exactly like a cornered animal realizing the inescapable trap had just violently snapped shut. I stepped right up to the podium, completely invading his personal space. He smelled of cold sweat and expensive cologne. I reached out and firmly gripped the microphone, prying it slowly and deliberately from his trembling, sweaty fingers. He did not possess the strength to resist. I looked at Monica, who was hyperventilating just 2 feet away, and then I turned to address the dead, silent room. I did not flee Preston. I said, my voice rolling through the massive speakers with absolute thunderous clarity. I just took a little detour to take back exactly what is mine. The massive, wealthy audience immediately gasped out loud in collective, profound, and absolute shock. I turned my head slightly, looking directly into my son's terrified, weeping eyes. I did not go to Cambodia. I told him, speaking softly enough that only he and Monica could hear the absolute finality in my tone. I went directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I then went straight to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I drained the Panamanian offshore accounts entirely dry before the sun even came up this morning. The syndicate brokers tried to withdraw their money exactly 30 minutes ago, and they found absolutely nothing. You are completely bankrupt, Preston, and you are entirely surrounded by federal agents. You played an incredibly dangerous game with exceptionally violent people, and you lost everything today. Preston let out a pathetic, broken whimper, his knees finally giving out completely. He collapsed onto the stage, burying his face in his trembling hands, as the reality of his total destruction finally crushed him. Monica screamed loudly as the heavily armed tactical agents moved in rapidly from the dark shadows to arrest them both. I stood tall and firm, silently watching pure, absolute, and unyielding justice finally arrive. The heavy doors at every corner of the ballroom swung open with explosive force. Over 24 federal agents in dark tactical gear flooded the venue. The blinding chandeliers reflected off the stark lettering across their vests. The velocity of their entrance sent a shockwave of pure panic rippling through the crowd. Wealthy investors and journalists scattered in absolute terror, dropping champagne flutes that shattered against the marble floors. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing, replaced by the commanding shouts of investigators securing the perimeter. I did not move a single muscle. I stood firmly at the edge of the stage, my posture completely rigid, silently watching the inescapable reality of my trap closing tightly around the people who had tried to bury me. Monica was the first to break. Her socialite persona dissolved into raw desperation. She let out a piercing scream that echoed across the room. She grabbed the layers of her gown, ripping the fabric as she sprinted toward the rear exit. She pushed past terrified waiters and stumbled over overturned chairs in a pathetic attempt to escape. She did not make it very far. 3 agents intercepted her before she could reach the curtains. They moved with calculated efficiency, grabbing her flailing arms and driving her down onto the floor. Monica shrieked wildly, kicking her heels and sobbing as the steel handcuffs snapped around her wrists. The elite society she had tried to impress watched in horrified silence as she was yanked to her feet, her perfect makeup ruined by panicked tears. Preston did not run. He could not run. He was incapable of standing. My son remained crumpled on the brightly lit stage. His sharp suit badly wrinkled, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked completely hollow, stripped permanently of all the arrogance that had fueled his treacherous ambition. As two agents approached the wooden podium to apprehend him, Preston suddenly scrambled forward frantically on his hands and knees. He crawled directly toward me across the stage, tears pouring down his pale cheeks. He reached out with trembling hands and desperately grabbed the fabric of my tailored trousers. "Dad, please," he sobbed wildly, his voice reduced to a pathetic whine that thoroughly disgusted me. "You have to stop them. Tell them it is a massive misunderstanding. Please, Dad, I am your only son. We are flesh and blood. You cannot let them take me away. I will do anything you want. I will sign whatever you need. Just do not let them put me in a federal prison. I am your family." I looked down at the weeping, pathetic creature groveling in the shadows at my feet. I felt absolutely nothing. The profound grief I had painfully experienced inside the dark motel room had already burned out, leaving behind only freezing ice. I did not see a beloved son. I simply saw a dangerous liability who had willingly handed my life directly over to a murderous international cartel. I slowly reached down and firmly pried his trembling fingers off my clothing, discarding his hands as if they were a foul disease. I stepped back purposefully, creating a deliberate physical boundary between us. "You stopped being my son the moment you put a price tag on my life," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that cut directly through his hysterical sobbing. "You chose the underground cartel. You chose the illicit money. You chose to brazenly forge my signature and send me to the slaughter. Now you get to live with the absolute consequences of your monstrous choices." There is no corporate bailout today, Preston. There is no magical rescue. The tactical agents firmly grasped Preston by his shaking shoulders, hauling his limp body up from the floor. He continued to weep hysterically, begging for mercy, but I turned my back on him. I watched completely unmoved as they securely cuffed his wrists tightly behind his back. The crowd of elite Denver society watched in stunned silence as my former son and his treacherous wife were marched forcefully through the center of the ballroom. The flashing cameras of the financial press, originally brought here to document my supposed downfall, were now capturing the humiliating, permanent destruction of Preston Caldwell. They were dragged out through the heavy mahogany doors, their terrified cries slowly fading down the corridor until they were completely gone. The team leader approached the stage, offering me a respectful nod before signaling his unit to process the scene. The immediate chaos had finally passed, leaving behind a room filled with shell-shocked investors and frightened executives. They were staring at me with a mixture of profound awe and absolute terror. They had just witnessed a brutal corporate execution, and they were waiting to see exactly where the blade would fall next. I turned, slowly walking back toward the center of the lit stage. I picked up the microphone that Preston had dropped during his pathetic collapse. I tested the audio, the sharp feedback instantly silencing any lingering whispers throughout the room. I looked out over the sea of pale faces, easily recognizing the powerful bankers, the real estate tycoons, and the media figures who had been fully prepared to accept my demise just 10 minutes ago. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began calmly, my voice projecting smooth authority across the silent ballroom. "I sincerely apologize for the dramatic interruption to your lovely evening. As you have clearly witnessed, Caldwell Commercial Real Estate faced a severe, incredibly dangerous internal threat. The two individuals you saw escorted out of this room orchestrated a complex, deeply illegal financial scheme. They actively attempted to utilize our pristine corporate infrastructure to facilitate a massive international money laundering operation, and they aggressively attempted to permanently remove me to ensure their unquestioned control." I paused purposefully, letting my gaze sweep deliberately across the front rows of the captivated audience. But as you can clearly see, the recent reports of my mental decline have been vastly significantly exaggerated. I did not cowardly flee the country. I proactively collaborated with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I personally initiated the complete lockdown of our corporate treasury, flawlessly securing every single legitimate asset. The illegal offshore accounts have been neutralized, and the immediate threat to this company has been surgically, permanently eliminated. The heavy tension in the massive room began to shift rapidly, transforming from pure terror into a deep, respectful reverence. I firmly gripped the sides of the wooden podium, leaning forward slightly to deliver my absolute final promise to the industry. I built this massive empire with my own two hands, I declared loudly, my voice resonating with pure, unstoppable power. I built it on a solid foundation of absolute stability, fierce loyalty, and unyielding, relentless strength. Let tonight serve as a permanent, undeniable reminder to absolutely anyone who mistakenly believes this company is vulnerable. Caldwell Commercial Real Estate is completely secure. The core operations remain incredibly profitable, and our financial future is perfectly bright. I have officially returned to my rightful position as Chief Executive Officer, and I promise you all, we are forcefully moving forward, stronger and infinitely more ruthless than ever before. 6 months later. The chaotic dust of the scandal had completely settled over Caldwell Commercial Real Estate. The massive federal investigation had swiftly concluded with absolute efficiency. We purged every single trace of the fraudulent shadow ledgers from our corporate network. Our legitimate investors quickly rallied behind the incredible display of proactive transparency. I permanently appointed Diane as the new Chief Financial Officer. She had earned the position with her unmatched brilliance and her absolute loyalty during our darkest hours. The corporate culture was entirely transformed. We were leaner, much stronger, and infinitely more resilient. The heavy burden of a looming betrayal no longer poisoned my daily operations. I sat comfortably behind my massive oak desk looking out over the sprawling Denver skyline, feeling a profound sense of total control. But there was one final necessary chapter to close. The federal sentencing had occurred 3 weeks ago. Monica had accepted a brutal plea deal, testifying extensively against the underground syndicate brokers to secure a slightly reduced sentence. Preston had desperately attempted to negotiate a similar arrangement, but he possessed no useful information to trade. The cartel had kept him completely in the dark, treating him merely as a useful, expendable idiot. He was sentenced to 12 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. I had ignored every single frantic phone call and every desperate letter he sent during the lengthy legal proceedings. Today, I had finally decided to visit him, not to offer any measure of comfort, but to definitively sever the final lingering ties of a broken past. The drive to the remote federal prison facility took 2 hours. The landscape gradually shifted from bustling city streets to vast, empty expanses of barren Colorado plains. I parked my car in the austere visitor lot, stepped out, and buttoned my heavy winter coat against the freezing morning wind. I walked through the heavily fortified security checkpoints with a completely blank expression. The guards searched me thoroughly and directed me into a stark, brightly lit visitation room. The walls were painted a sickening shade of pale green. Heavy steel tables were bolted directly to the concrete floor. The air smelled strongly of harsh chemical bleach and human despair. I sat down at the designated table and waited in the suffocating silence. 10 minutes later, a heavy metal door slid open with a loud mechanical clatter. 2 armed correctional officers marched Preston into the room. The sight of my former son was genuinely shocking. The arrogant, impeccably groomed executive was completely gone. He was wearing a shapeless, faded orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his shrinking frame. His skin was incredibly pale, stretched tightly across his cheekbones. His hair was messy and unkempt. The dark, heavy bags beneath his eyes spoke of endless, terrifying nights spent in absolute fear. He sat down heavily across from me, keeping his gaze firmly fixed on the scratched metal table between us. He looked like a shattered, empty shell of a human being. "Thank you for coming," he mumbled, his voice raspy and remarkably weak. "I was beginning to think you would never speak to me again. I am not here to offer you absolution." "Preston," what I replied, keeping my tone perfectly flat and devoid of any paternal warmth. I came here today to close this chapter permanently. I came to look you in the eyes and ensure you fully comprehend the absolute finality of your situation. Preston finally looked up and his eyes were brimming with desperate tears. Dad, please, he begged, leaning forward against the steel table. I am begging you for help. This place is an absolute nightmare. The people in here are violent monsters. I cannot survive 12 years in this cage. I need you to hire a better legal team. I need you to fund a massive appellate campaign. We can argue that I was under extreme duress from the cartel. We can say they forced me to sign those forged documents. You have unlimited resources. You can easily afford the best defense attorneys in the country. You can get me out of here. Please, Dad. I am your family. I stared at him, feeling absolutely zero empathy for the weeping man sitting across from me. He was still trying to manipulate the situation. He was still entirely refusing to accept personal responsibility for his treacherous actions. You are exactly where you belong, I stated coldly, refusing to break eye contact. You made a conscious, deliberate choice to borrow tens of millions of dollars from a violent criminal syndicate. You chose to secretly gamble away an absolute fortune in underground casinos. You chose to forge my signature and actively attempt to frame me for your catastrophic failures. You put a definitive price tag on my freedom and my life to save your own skin. I did it because I was terrified, Preston sobbed loudly, wiping his wet face with his shaking hands. I made a terrible mistake. I know I did. But you are my father. You are supposed to protect me. You are supposed to help me when I fall. I leaned forward slightly, closing the physical distance between us. True accountability means facing the devastating consequences of your actions entirely alone. I told him, my voice dropping to a harsh, lethal whisper. I gave you every conceivable advantage in this world. I gave you an elite education, a massive trust fund, and a prominent seat at the head of a billion-dollar empire. You squandered every single gift because you possessed absolutely zero character. You are not a victim, Preston. You are the sole architect of your own destruction. I will not spend a single cent of my hard-earned money trying to save you from the prison sentence you entirely deserve. Preston stared at me in absolute horrifying shock. His desperate tears stopped flowing, completely replaced by a look of profound, crushing realization. He finally understood that the massive safety net he had exploited his entire life was permanently gone. The unlimited bank accounts were closed. The protective father was completely dead. He was utterly terrifyingly alone. I stood up slowly from the cold metal chair. I adjusted the lapels of my heavy coat and looked down at him one last time. Goodbye, Preston, I said firmly. I turned around and walked purposefully toward the heavy exit door. I did not look back when he suddenly began to sob loudly behind me. I did not hesitate when the armed guards ordered him to stand up and return to his miserable cell. I walked straight through the sterile security corridors, my footsteps echoing with absolute certainty. The heavy steel gates buzzed loudly and slid open, allowing me to step outside into the crisp, freezing Colorado air. The bright morning sun hit my face, warming my skin against the biting winter wind. I took a deep, cleansing breath, filling my lungs with pure, unburdened freedom. The toxic leeches were finally gone. My empire was entirely secure. I walked toward my waiting car, fully ready to embrace a new, powerful chapter of my life. For decades, I believed that giving my son everything was the ultimate expression of a father's love. I was wrong. True love isn't about writing blank checks or cushioning every fall. It's about instilling character, integrity, and accountability. When you hand over power without demanding respect, you don't build an heir, you create a monster. Blood might make you family, but loyalty and honesty are what keep you there. I had to lose the illusion of the son I wanted to finally see the man he chose to be. Sometimes the hardest boundary you set is the one that saves your life. Have you ever had to cut off a toxic family member to protect your own peace? How did you find the courage to do it? Share your story in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more intense life stories.